Okay, so this one's quite interesting. Moore's Law is dead. The leaks are continuing, this time with news on purported PlayStation 6 silicon, codenamed Orion. Lots of response from our audience about this, lots of questions. And I think, basically we should just talk about the stuff that has been leaked. Codenamed Orion, Zen 6 CPU architecture. There's talk of 40 to 48 RDNA 5 compute units, clocked at over 3 gigahertz, G7 memory, 160-bit or 192-bit bus, total board power 160 watts, lower than PlayStation 5's to 190 to 220 watts. Also some performance approximations, 3 times the rasterization performance of the PlayStation 5, RT performance potentially 5 to 10 times higher due to RDNA 5 architectural improvements. And it will have full backwards compatibility with PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. So, Oliver, I don't know what to make of this because this looks like a sort of specification for an APU that's going to be coming sooner rather than later. And I think if we go back to what the last sort of word, official word, if you like, from Sony on this, it came from Mark Cerny himself, basically saying, yep, RDNA 5, AMD's going flat out. That's going to happen sooner rather than later. And we're going to be taking, or rather Sony is going to be taking, a multi-year approach, which kind of suggests that this is going to be much further on down the road. I mean, here we are in the year of our Lord 2025, and 2027, 2028, a lot can happen in that time period. I don't know what your take is on that.
Yeah, it's not totally clear to me exactly what will happen. I kind of tend to think that 2027 is a reasonable time frame for a console like this, but I could also see it slipping into 2028 or something like that, just depending on what Sony has to offer here. This looks like pretty much very similar to what Microsoft is offering in a lot of respects, just with slightly less CUs on the GPU side of things, a little bit of some differences in the CPU side. On the Sony side, you have 8 Zen 6 cores. On the Microsoft side, apparently you have 3 Zen 6 cores and 8 Zen C cores. A little bit of a difference there. The memory interfaces and probably the amount of memory in both devices as a result would probably be fairly similar, you'd imagine, with both devices speculated to be using 192-bit memory buses potentially. And then in terms of that GPU, you do have some difference there, but it's not like they do seem of a kind with each other, and they do seem similar in ways that would suggest a sooner release date to me, potentially based off this information, than a release date that would be into 2028 or something like that, as Mark Cerny has kind of hinted at in very broad strokes, like you said. But it's important to mention here that this is like information that came from a presentation to Sony, rather, I should say, from AMD that apparently occurred 2 years ago. So plans can change. And also this is information that comes from one source. Kepler L2 has confirmed that he's heard similar things in terms of the broad perspective on this, but not in terms of the nitty-gritty spec details. So a lot could change, but I would definitely agree that from at least Mark's phrasing, it seemed like he was trying to differentiate the Sony effort and then RDNA 5, or as he called it, whatever AMD is calling the next generation graphics card. He was not too up on that naming scheme necessarily, but I think there is a bit of a conflict there, but exactly how that will be resolved, I don't know. To me, this looks like a reasonable offering for next generation console, but it's also an offering that is by its nature 2 years out of date, right? So a lot can change between now and then.
I mean, there are some things that I do think ring true on here, like, for example, aiming for a $500 price point kind of makes sense for a console. The concept of it being efficiency driven, total board power. I'm curious if it would actually be lower than PlayStation 5's. I guess that is going to depend quite a lot on what the nature is of RDNA 5.
Could be a little optimistic too on AMD's side of things.
That sounds really, just to butt in, just look at the 9070 XT and its total wattage. When attached to an SoC, thinking about lower clocks, you're still even, there's still like a whole CPU on there. There's the memory, there's the SSD and controllers. It does sound a little bit optimistic for me, and I would actually imagine it to be kind of a higher power device like the original PlayStation 5 was for its time of release, if it does maintain these specs.
Right. Yeah, we have actually seen across the sort of direction of travel is that consoles are becoming more power demanding from generation to generation. PlayStation 5 Pro, kind of similar to PS4 Pro in that it consumed much the same amount of power as the base unit, but did it via a die shrink. So yeah, I don't know. I still think it's probably going to be in the sort of 200 watt area. It just kind of makes sense. I think that there's a big question mark here, which is we just don't know what RDNA 5 is. There have been some talk about 3x rasterization performance versus PlayStation 5. I don't know. Again, this Oliver, you talked to Mark Cerny about this, and basically we're obviously paraphrasing here, but it seemed to be the case that rasterization boosts probably aren't going to be that much of a revelatory thing going forward. And the emphasis is moving more towards ray tracing and machine learning.
Well, especially when you look at the context of like the PlayStation 5 Pro only having a rasterization boost as we measure it across a variety of games of 30% at best, like 35 or 40%.
Right.
Certainly, achieving easily 2 times the rasterization of a PlayStation 5 Pro, 3 times the rasterization of a PlayStation 5 as has been reported here would be a huge leap. And I wouldn't even, to me, that does not seem like the central focus of any next generation console. It seems like the central focus of any next generation console would be having great machine learning acceleration, would be having much improved RT acceleration, would be having this cavalcade of features, right? And would be less about achieving some multiple of the last generation console's performance. In my head, considering the PlayStation 6, I really didn't think a 3x multiple would be the case here. I thought maybe like a 2x multiple or something like that. This seems like a very ambitious design for a console, especially a console that's apparently a $500 price tag. I think that's quite ambitious for this level of performance, especially when you consider like the kinds of GPUs in this category on the PC side are like $1,000 GPUs, right? And then you combine out the CPU, memory. This is a pretty compelling device if they can indeed hit that price point and this level of performance, especially within like a reasonable power envelope. That's pretty incredible, I think.
What do you think, Alex?
I agree with Oliver, and I could just give a really an example of that. So rasterization is tapped out largely in regards to how it scales. So when you double your rasterization power, you're taking either the same thing and running at 2x the frame rate maybe, or you're doubling the size of whatever you're doing. Maybe you're doubling the triangle count of an object. You are doubling the textures in one scene. Maybe the bandwidth is allowing you to throw 2x particles in front of the screen in one moment. Honestly, the visual payback that you get for doing that is a lot smaller than when you increase how much more ray tracing you can do, especially at this nascent stage in ray tracing development. Because if you go from little to no ray tracing acceleration like you see in the PlayStation 5 to massively multiplying it by, what was the numbers quoted there? Was it 5? 3 to 5? 5 to 10 times. You're moving from a game having at most maybe something like ray tracing shadows to adding in multiple ray tracing effects at that one point in time at the same frame rate. And the visual impact of increasing that part of the acceleration is so much larger to the end image. And I think that's really what Mark Cerny gets at the end of the day, where the scaling for what you get back visually by increasing stuff like ROP throughput and, texture fetching and all these things, they are so much smaller for the consumer's visual experience than increasing things that are new frontiers of rendering, which still have a lot of place to grow and optimization to occur, unlike the 35 years or whatever we have of rasterization being grown and optimized. So I really do think actually this rumor of the 3x rasterization seems a little bit incredible. And at the same time, it seems like, but why would they focus on that is my question, when it seems like it's counter narrative to what Mark Cerny talked about.
That's kind of my take on it as well. I guess there were a lot of caveats that Oliver talked about in terms of when this information was actually circulating. It's enough to say, well, actually, they could have settled on a completely different approach. And it does seem that there are certain discrepancies in terms of that information and what Mark Cerny's actually said. And I think if you look at the design of the PlayStation 5 Pro, it's pretty clear what the direction of travel is. when you looked at 4 to 4 Pro, it was essentially just doubling of GPU, right? And that's not really what we saw with the 5 Pro. It was something more interesting, I think.
Way more.
It was kind of like a foundational project for what's going to be happening in the future. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing, right? And I think it's similarly the case with whatever Microsoft's planning. I mean, their biggest console leap ever isn't going to be powered exclusively by compute units or whatever. It's actually more in terms of features and machine learning. We've just really begun to see what machine learning is doing on that respect. We're still on that sort of Wild West frontier, so to speak. Nevertheless, all of these rumors that have circulated have brought about a wealth of supporter questions, which I think we should take a look at. This one from Bulbous_Bow. Bravo and congratulations on your independence! The source of the new Xbox and PS6 rumors, Moore's Law is dead, suggested that the Xbox may be targeting 5080 levels of performance, PS6 around 20 to 30% below this. He speculates that both consoles should be sufficient to max out 4K 120Hz TVs with a good level of ray tracing support, obviously factoring in upscaling. I'm curious, would this accord with your experience of this class of hardware? What do you think and do you think it likely that the Xbox can justify the cost of the extra silicon, never mind that it might not be subsidized, with a qualitatively better experience? What can we say about this one? This one from Concrete Llama. Wishing you a merry independence time_unit. A day, a month, a year, I don't know, and a happy rest of the year. So there have been some rumors about PS6 being roughly equivalent to a 9070 XT and the next Xbox equivalent to a 5080. Is it just me or is that mildly disappointing?
Wow.
We were told to expect a massive generational leap, but well, I have a 5080. I think it's great and delivers far better performance than a Series X or PS5. I'd hardly call it a massive generational leap. The 5080 is high-end now, but it won't be by the time the consoles come out.
Well, I already want to say something, if I may.
Yeah, say something, Alex. This is the purpose of a show discussing the latest gaming and technology news.
Well, when the comparison between a 9070 XT and a 5080, I feel a little bit odd. Because a 5080 is much more actually capable than a 9070 XT in key areas that are important in terms of software feature set. You do have all the ray reconstruction, multi-frame gen stuff that currently isn't there on the AMD side of things. But you also, when you do, so if you maybe play these two GPUs in rasterization, you see this 20 to 30% deficit that the user is talking about here and everyone keeps talking about. But as soon as you turn on a game that is a next generation offering with path tracing, you actually see that these GPUs are very different. So I don't actually like this GPU comparison between the two consoles using a 5080 and a RX 9070 XT because it kind of misses the entire point of transformational technologies that you see on the NVIDIA side that still have yet to enter on the AMD side of things. And if you do look at an RTX 5080 and you compare it, like an RTX 5080 can run path trace Cyberpunk 4K output targeting 120 FPS, and you compare that to the visual output of the PlayStation 5 version, to me, that actually does look next generationally different in a lot of ways. So I actually wouldn't discount the idea of an RTX 5080 being a transformational experience for someone who only has a base console.
Yeah.
So
I agree entirely. Yeah, it's like very, very different.
Yeah.
Well,
I think defining a console generation by the standards of current generation software is always misleading. Because if you look at early period like PS3 or PS4, even PS5 software, that's not maximizing the console. So just saying I took this rasterized game on PS5 and I ran it at 4K 120. Is that really a next generation experience? It's well, you're just kind of question begging. That's not really going to be the case with any generation of console software. But I would say that in terms of the 5080 9070 XT comparison, Kepler is saying this is the biggest generational transformation since GCN on the AMD side. He says it's going to have all the features of Blackwell and then some. He's really saying this is going to be a transformational architecture in RDNA 5, even more perhaps than RDNA 4 was. So, by his standards, at least, it will be apparently, relatively capable in ray tracing, relatively capable in path tracing compared to extant AMD architecture. So, at least in that context, again, this is all operating off of information that we don't really have an independent way of verifying ourselves.
Right.
then it should be a pretty capable machine.
Yeah, I mean, but there is still this move to a different paradigm, really. I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it? Everybody is now sort of focused on replicating the current NVIDIA machine learning feature set, and rightly so, because there's some fantastic stuff going on there. But this is just the beginning, right? Obviously, NVIDIA aren't going to be standing still. There's going to be new innovations. We've seen some of them at CES this year. And, the concept of having what you might consider at that point base level hardware that's capable of embracing all of these features fully, I think is hugely exciting. And the more developer take up you get, the more deeply integrated it is into the way games are made. I think it is going to be like a proper generational leap. I mean, you're quite right, Alex. I mean, the 5080 is. I think it's probably like closer more to 200 frames per second with path-based Cyberpunk. And
with MFG, I forgot about MFG. I was just doing FG in my brain there. Not even MFG.
Frame generation is going to be a thing, right? Yeah. And obviously, this is the other thing, of course. All of this discussion about maxing out a 4K 120 hertz TV. I think it all really depends on how many people are actually using 120 hertz TVs at that point. I think we're sort of also potentially moving away from the fact that how can I say it? The console experience is very, very different to a PC experience. The demands of the audience are very, very different. It's why, certainly from the last generation, 30 FPS was fine on a console, and you'd go to PC for those higher frame rate experiences. Mm-hmm. I think with this generation, we've kind of moved on to the expectation that 60 frames per second is where things need to be. But the difference in experience in something like, let's say, The Last of Us, between 60 and 120, I can fully see developers still doubling down on fidelity at 60 rather than going full out for 120. But, I guess the question is at that point, the extent to which, frame generation is considered part of the overall design, or basically a value add to produce a 120 hertz mode. I mean, this is the whole thing about this, and I think you're quite right in terms of the way the discussion's rolled out, Alex, which is to say that there's this massive change in the way games are going to be created that's going to happen within the next few years. And here we are talking about, hey, it's like a 9070 XT, which is a part that was never really designed for this new paradigm. And it is what RDNA 5 apparently is. So, yeah, I think, there's a lot of question marks and a lot of caveats about these specs at the moment. I think we need to be a bit cautious about taking them on board, because I saw some headlines saying PlayStation 6 specs confirmed. Basically that's not what the original leak was saying. Mm-hmm. But it is a spec that is out there, and it is kind of plausible. Interesting stuff. I don't really know where we're going to go from this, except to say that there's a long process ahead of us as we move into the next generation. Probably going to see more stuff from Microsoft first, I'd say, based on Mark Cerny's comments about a multi-year schedule. Mm-hmm. And we'll see what happens there and how they come to define what a generational leap actually is. But I think, we are seeing change. We are seeing machine learning taking point. We are seeing technologies like frame generation. There's a stronger focus on that. I actually saw this week that FSR Redstone seems to be on track for happening this year, which is great news, because again, it's all about consolidating these kind of next generation features and standardizing them and making sure that no GPU owner is kind of locked out of that. The process is ongoing, I'd say. Okay, but there have been more leaks, Oliver, specifically about the PlayStation handheld, a rumored companion device to the PlayStation 6 home console. What's kind of happening there?
Yeah, so apparently it's this little monolithic die with, on the CPU side, apparently they're going to go with, at least this is part of the AMD proposal, 4 Zen 6C cores, which is interesting. It's a smaller core count than any existing Zen 5 design, to my knowledge. But I suppose for this device, they would consider a lower core count, in part because I would presume they would probably be primarily targeting 30 FPS in the software that they're going to run on this device. On the GPU side of things, they're talking about 12 to 20 CUs potentially in the design, But Kepler_L2 has already stated a few times that he expects it will have 16 CUs based off of his leaks from different documentation. So I'd presume that would still be true for this. And of course, that falls within the middle of this range. So those two details are quite consistent. On the memory side, I'm a little bit surprised, actually, because there's no LPDDR6 in this spec, surprisingly. Which is a shame, as that would have much higher speeds. LPDDR6, I presume, is a little bit too far away. They're talking about LPDDR5X 7500 or greater in this spec leak. LPDDR5X 8533 megatransfers per second is the very highest spec of LPDDR5X, and that would be equivalent to 137 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. So that would be an upper bound for this device. If you go over to LPDDR6 memory, that top end of the spec could potentially go up to 230 gigabytes per second in its highest initial configuration, which is 14,400 megatransfers per second memory. But of course, in context, this is with a device that probably has a much, definitely has a much smaller display, has a 1080p display in all likelihood, is not going to be targeting 4K 60, maybe is going to be targeting 1080p 30. And in that context, this spec leak would make a lot more sense in terms of actually targeting realistic visuals for device of that capability. There are some other hardware details as well, apparently, in this leak, like a USB Type-C video out. That's a big deal for us, obviously.
Yes.
Haptic vibration, which is what you'd expect from Sony, given their focus on the DualSense controller this generation. Dual mics, a touchscreen, hopefully an OLED touchscreen there. Probably also with 120 hertz and VRR technologies. I'd expect that to be part of the spec as well, especially if it's an LCD. And they're also talking about a micro SD slot and an M.2 SSD slot, which is kind of surprising. I just presume they would go with the M.2 SSD, but apparently there's going to be a mix of storage technologies, at least in the proposal, there's a mix of storage technologies. And then a 15-watt TBP, which is probably a realistic upper bound for what Sony would end up targeting with a device like this if you want more than like a couple hours of battery life, or if you want it to be reasonably slim and reasonably light for a device like this. So I think this looks interesting. It's kind of they're making slightly different choices than the other makers of handhelds are with the Strix Point APU. In part, I think because Strix Point is not really designed primarily for handhelds. It's designed primarily for laptops. So this has a smaller CPU. It has a bigger GPU in all likelihood when you consider the size of those RDNA 5 CUs. It has a similar memory interface. The performance target they're going for here is a higher performance target for rendering than those existing extant Strix Point devices. They're talking about Series S level, roughly Series S level, or in MLID's leak here, they're phrasing it as 0.5x PS5 level, which is about at that Series S level of capability. But then, of course, in terms of ray tracing, in terms of machine learning, you'd have that additional level of capability probably above and beyond that 0.5x spec, right? If we're talking about a much higher multiple potentially for ray tracing, or actually having some capability to do machine learning, which would be important for next generation PSSR in this kind of device. So I think it's an interesting leak. Again, you take it with a grain of salt based on the fact there's not a variety of sourcing in this leak, and based on the fact that it is at least a couple years old relative to the current time. So those are some caveats here. But I think it's an interesting leak, and it suggests a device that is probably quite performant, but is also within the realm of kind of current generation memory technologies. But it is pushing out this more advanced GPU architecture, which should make a big difference.
I think, the lesson learned from Switch 2 is that bespoke optimization for a specific architecture actually does yield benefits. And secondly, the importance of DLSS on Switch 2 has kind of again highlighted the importance of machine learning components in there as well. The only real surprise from my perspective is the 4 Zen cores, Zen 6C cores from that, bearing in mind if you're looking for easy porting of games from PlayStation 5, for example, that's quite a lot of computational grunt you might be losing. Because, of course, it's a whole new architecture that's significantly better than Zen 2, but at the same time, the target apparently for this is a 15-watt APU. So, yeah, those cores are going to have to be... They're not going to be. It's not going to be like for like, I don't think. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, that's the one. The whole the only wrinkle in this for me. I think GPU wise, the scaling is going to be nice, kind of like we see with the handhelds. But as soon as you reduce that, amount of cores available to the game. And those games on PS5 have been targeting, was it like 6.5, 7 cores or something like that? Because there's also system reservation you have to consider. That's another thing.
The other
really
thing, of course.
With the Switch,
what's going to happen with system reservation on a quad core processor?
That doesn't sound nice from my perspective, whatever it is. So that's why I'm wondering if this is really the spec then in the end that they would go with versus, another proposal. But it does seem like I would prefer maybe even smaller GPU and a larger CPU just to head up those areas where games are going to be targeting 60 FPS, etc.
It is a little bit suspicious too, just because of how area efficient those Zen 5C cores are at the moment, because they have so much less cache than the Zen 5 full fat cores. Assuming that trend held true for the Zen 6 generation of products, I'd presume that 8 Zen 6C cores would not break the area bank in terms of actually having the chip be reasonable.
I mean, the concept of a Sony handheld, I mean, there's pedigree there. The Vita, never quite landed where it should, but ultimately it was, a completely different class of product to what Sony was developing at the time. I think what's quite interesting with this is obviously it's going to be components of the same lineage as the main PlayStation, which should make cross-platform development similar to what's happening with Series S or versus Series X. Obviously, with PlayStation 6, the power gulf is probably going to be significantly wider. But there's this whole library of PlayStation 5 games that could conceivably come across. And again, let's not go into the whole power saver PS5 thing. We did that a couple of weeks ago. But let's just say I'm going to be very interested to see how that power saver manifests on actual shipping games once they are supported.